I always longed for the simplicity of an ordinary family. Growing up in foster care, I was familiar with the feeling of being alone in the world. I had foster parents as a child, but no blood ties. What I truly yearned for was a family of my own, the perfect family with a loving husband, adorable children, and me. So when a kind-hearted man proposed to me, I was overjoyed. With this man, I thought I could finally build that ordinary family I'd always dreamed of. However, in believing so, I was the world's biggest fool. My husband, George, callously ordered me around after I came home from a long day at work. "Hannah, make dinner now. Mom and Emily are starving," he'd say barely 2 seconds after I walked in the door. George, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, none of them ever thought of cooking. My name is Hannah, and I found myself stuck with this terrible family. At 29, I worked for a large corporation where George was also employed. We met at the same company. George was 30 years old, but since he couldn't get into college right after graduating high school, we ended up graduating college at the same time. First of all, it's important to mention that George was currently unemployed. He had a dispute with his boss in the sales department and quit his job. George was angry, claiming his boss was cold-hearted, but I knew otherwise. Even though George and I were married, we worked in different departments of the same company. I worked in the general affairs department, handling office work. My dedication and hard work were trusted and respected by my colleagues. During this time, the sales department manager, where George worked, came to me for advice. Nervously, I asked him what the matter was. He tiredly opened his mouth and explained that George had suddenly handed in his resignation that day. Shocked and confused, I had no idea this was happening. The manager explained the situation to me. George would casually leave work, even if his tasks weren't finished, and he'd dump his overtime work on his colleagues. When confronted, he would lash out in anger, claiming that we shared housework since we both worked. He also insisted on leaving work on time, citing concerns for his mother and sister's well-being. Feeling guilty and embarrassed, I apologized profusely to the manager. However, he reassured me that it wasn't my fault. He expressed his disgust for George, who quit his job without consulting me, his wife. George believed he would quickly find a new job, but the reality was harsh. Despite his efforts in job hunting, he faced rejection after rejection. He resented his previous boss, convinced that he had sabotaged his chances with other companies. I can swear that my company does not engage in such practices. Even after submitting a resignation, it's common knowledge among working people to stay in the company for at least a month. There are matters like work handover and procedures to be dealt with. However, George slammed his resignation letter onto the manager's desk and went home the same day. It was obvious to me that such an unreasonable person would not be hired by any company. George was content with giving his small severance pay to his mother and sister. He was raised in a single-parent family with his mother and sister Emily. Their father divorced his mother and left, which seems to have been a wise decision. Both my mother-in-law and Emily are healthy and capable of working, but they do nothing. I pay for living expenses and do all the work. Whenever I asked George to help out at home, he yelled at me, saying, "My mother and Emily are my precious family, girl. You should be devoted to helping us out." It made no sense to me, so I snapped back at him. "Forget about your mother, but Emily is 23 years old. At least let her get a part-time job." George adored Emily a lot, who was 7 years younger than him. Emily was also taking advantage of George's kindness, pleading for pocket money. As I firmly refused to give her money, George started working part-time. It was a job managing a warehouse for a courier service. George told people around him that he quit his job at a major corporation because his family was sick. He is a man who lies as he breathes just to keep his reputation. And so, George's part-time earnings became Emily's dating expenses. Not doing any housework or work, Emily started going out with men. I was fed up with my mother-in-law stealing bills from my wallet out of her grief for money. Even if I talked to George about it, he would get mad at me, saying, "Take care of my mom if you're my wife." This is why I can't stand people who grew up all alone in foster care like you. My mother-in-law scoffed at me, calling me wicked. I was living my days with the worst family. But one day, an encounter that changed my depressing daily life arrived. When I came home after buying groceries after work, there were unfamiliar shoes at the entrance. Large-sized men's sneakers. I thought we had a guest over since the shoes were larger than George's. Then a young man popped out. He was tall, had a handsome face, and his hair was light brown. When I thought Emily had brought her boyfriend, the man apologized, saying, "I'm sorry. I was in the words of dating Emily, but I'll take it back." Contrary to his frivolous appearance, his tone was polite, a wise young man making sound judgments. I spontaneously asked the young man who was about to leave with his sneakers on, "What's your name?" "I'm Emily's sister-in-law, Hannah." I introduced myself. The young man looked up and smiled a little. He looked like a player, but he had a smart expression. After he finished putting on his sneakers, he introduced himself. "I'm James. I work as a bartender." According to him, Emily confessed to him, and he was about to accept, but he declined. The reason was that Emily showed her true nature and spilled everything because of alcohol. "All my money is from George's part-time job. My sister-in-law is stingy and ugly. She makes me work and do housework." James deeply regretted that he was inexperienced and couldn't spot a good woman because of that. But he's a kind-hearted person who couldn't leave drunk Emily alone and sent her home. Moreover, James paid for the taxi fare. Just at such times, both George and my mother-in-law were not at home. So James got our house key from Emily, who was wasted, and carried her to our living room. I couldn't just leave her at the entrance. "I swear I didn't steal anything, ma'am," he pleaded. He seemed to be studying at a vocational school during the day and working as an apprentice bartender at night. Emily had called him out after school, claiming to work at a clothing store. James didn't see through Emily's lies until the last moment. Despite his flashy light brown hair, he was a serious and sincere young man. His natural hair color, a mix, matched the flashy appearance. "This is the business card for the bar I work at. Sorry for the trouble. He's running late, but he said he's ready to work now," he explained. "Thank you for bringing Emily home." "Have a great shift," I replied, smiling as James left. Normally, I would report a young man who was at home without permission and had a connection with Emily. But I intuitively thought that James was a trustworthy person with good nature. It was a silver lining that he hadn't been deceived by Emily. When I entered the living room, Emily was indeed drunk and asleep. Annoyance aside, to avoid dealing with a potential cold, I covered her with a blanket. Suddenly, Emily woke up and opened her mouth, unable to pronounce her words exactly. "Hey, where's James?" "My boyfriend with the brown hair, so handsome," she mumbled, checking her phone. James had verbally told her he couldn't date her, but it was in vain. Emily was too drunk to understand James's intentions. Cleverly, James had politely declined through a text. Emily had no recollection of revealing her true nature. She cried and grew angry, feeling like James had abandoned her. "What's wrong with me? I've been deceived," Emily wailed, oblivious to her own deception. Ignoring the commotion, I started cooking dinner. When George and my mother-in-law came home and heard Emily's side of the story, George became furious. "Did he mess with you, Emily? Where does he work? I'll punch him for you. We're going to demand damages." Indeed, poor Emily was foolish and pitiful, completely due to her own resentment. As I worried about causing trouble for James, Emily glared at me. "Anna, did you say something to James?" she demanded, showing me the text on her phone. The message read, "I can't date a liar." Emily had drunkenly revealed everything but thought I was the one who tattled. George and my mother-in-law also confronted me. So I explained the truth of my encounter with James at the entrance. He was trying to take care of Emily and was about to leave the house when we ran into each other. That's all, I asserted, making it clear that I hadn't said anything unnecessary to him. George clicked his tongue and turned his face away from me. "Emily, let's eat sushi today. It's premium sushi," he declared, deciding to order sushi delivery on his own and indulging with my mother-in-law and Emily, all on my tab, without touching any of the dinner. As I sat alone, eating the dinner I had prepared, the laughter of the three of them echoed through the house. Eating sushi as a family is the best. It makes up for the usual terrible cooking, George remarked between bites. Really, it's so delicious it compensates for the usual bad food. My mother-in-law chimed in, joining the laughter. Agreeing with them, George laughed along, enduring their mockery. But amidst their joviality, I felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Is this the family I had yearned for when I got married? How foolish I had been. Suddenly, the face of my only family member, with whom I had become estranged after marriage, floated in my mind. For some reason, I recalled James's kind smile and felt a pang of longing. Several days later, a turning point arrived while I was cleaning the house on my day off. George brought me a bank book. Seeing the deposit notification, panic surged within me. The bank book recorded the savings I had carefully accumulated before our marriage. With a triumphant look, George handed me the cash card. I'm giving the $100,000 you saved to my parents and sister. If you refuse, we divorce, he declared. This was the money I had been saving for our future child's expenses. I had hoped that having a child would change things, that George might distance himself from his mother and Emily. But George crushed those dreams, saying, I care about my mother and sister more than our kid. Do as you like. Realizing that building a happy and ordinary family with George was impossible, I showed him the divorce papers I had prepared. If you accept this, we're getting a divorce. It's over between us, I stated firmly. With joy, George filled in the necessary information on the divorce papers and handed them back. Ignoring his elation over the $100,000, I packed my bags and left the house, submitting the divorce papers, which got registered without a hitch. Returning to my adoptive father's house, I called him. Hannah, come back to your family home, he said. I, who had rebelled against my adoptive father since adolescence, felt tears welling up. Despite our strained relationship, my adoptive father forgave me, even though I had been ungrateful. Living quietly at home, memories from my childhood flooded back. I remembered being taken from the orphanage to my adoptive father's house. At that time, I had an adoptive mother who loved me as if I were her own daughter, but she passed away from illness. During my junior high school days, I began rebelling against my adoptive father. His frequent absences due to work left me feeling lonely. But upon reflection, I realized that both my adoptive father and late adoptive mother had cared for me deeply. Fixated on the idea of a normal family, I had overlooked the love of those closest to me. Now divorced, I felt a huge burden lifted off my shoulders. With this weight off, I threw myself into my work. It was during this time that I ran into James again. As I was leaving work one day, I bumped into the sales department manager in the elevator hall. Good job today. I greeted him, to which he kindly responded, You've been through a lot. You look better than before, and I'm so happy for you. He sincerely praised me for holding up well after my divorce. As I bowed and entered the elevator, the manager's tone turned serious. There's a bar that's been talked about in the sales department, he mentioned. I want to go, but it's a bit too fancy for an old man like me. Despite being married with children in high school, he expressed curiosity about the place. What kind of place is it? A cafe or something? He wondered aloud. He then humbly asked me to accompany him. Knowing the manager's sincerity, I agreed to accompany him to the bar. The bar, recommended by the manager's colleagues, turned out to be a hidden gem in the basement. Don't be nervous, the manager reassured me as he opened the door to the shop. Inside, the decor was chic, appealing to younger crowds. But what shocked me was when I looked at the bar counter and saw James, the bartender I had encountered before my divorce. He seemed a bit surprised but quickly greeted me with a smile. Welcome, it's been a long time, Hannah, he said. The manager, noticing their interaction, raised his voice. Do you know each other? The women in my department have been talking about a very handsome man working here. He looks like an actor, he chuckled. James, however, downplayed it. Not at all. I'm just an apprentice bartender. What would you like to order? As I was not accustomed to bars, I let James recommend a drink for me. Meanwhile, the manager opted for a non-alcoholic cocktail. The atmosphere was serene and the clientele were refined. During our conversation, James mentioned that his father was the owner of the bar. Despite my initial rebellion and college pursuits, I found myself inspired by my father's line of work. As we sipped our drinks, I mentioned my recent divorce. The boss, unusually furious, commented, "That woman's ex-husband is outrageous." "I shouldn't have given him a retirement allowance," muttered the boss. "But did you get drunk on a non-alcoholic drink?" James prepared a mint soda, smiling at me as I forced a smile. He offered the Minnesota to the boss for free. The boss calmed down a bit and, while drinking Minnesota, asked, "Hey, mister, do you send drinks from other customers like in dramas?" James laughed cheerfully at the boss's serious question. "Ah, I've never done it. Urban legend, perhaps." Amidst the pleasant atmosphere at the bar, my phone suddenly rang. I was about to step outside, but James assured me it was okay to answer the call here. Upon confirming it was George, my ex-husband whom I had divorced, I was annoyed by the interruption of the fun gathering, but I answered due to the persistent calls. Before I could inquire about the purpose of the call, George complained loudly, "I can't withdraw money. Your balance is zero." Of course, that's after I transferred the deposit to another account. Would anyone keep a passbook with $100,000 deposit in a house where those three greedy people live? I retorted. The passbook George stole from me was a dummy. The real one was carefully hidden by me. That's how I still had the $100,000. When I informed him, George was dumbfounded. Meanwhile, my former mother-in-law and Emily were overseas, living luxuriously. They gambled, and as their funds started to run out, they attempted to dip into my $100,000. However, they couldn't withdraw the money and were distressed enough to call me. George threatened me to send all my assets immediately. I refused and handed over the dummy passbook obediently. I also relinquished the house in the property division, coldly declaring that I no longer knew anything about it. Meanwhile, James asked me to lend him my phone. In front of me and the boss, he ruthlessly demanded, "George, there is a tab of $3,000 for your sister's drinks. I'm sorry, but please pay." After saying only that, James returned my phone to me. "So work hard for your beloved mother and sister, big brother," I said as George cried for help. But I hung up the call. Apologizing for the fuss, James offered me a cocktail with a smile. "It's on me. An Andrew ginger ale for the boss. Let's toast to the refreshing turn of events. James, the boss." And I toasted to George's miserable fate. From then on, George truly fell into a hell of debt. When he was at a loss in a hotel overseas, a kind gentleman approached him. The gentleman, a precedent in finance, offered to lend him money if George was in trouble. George, not direly in need of money, jumped at it without considering the interest. As a result, his debt ballooned to $500,000, and he was in a crisis. The kind gentleman even prepared a job for him to repay the loan. Now, it seems George is working on a fishing boat, and nobody knows where he is. Emily and my mother-in-law had an obligation to repay. Working from morning till night except for sleeping, they sold their house and now live in a small apartment. I was going about my usual routine at my parents' home when, unusually, my foster father was also present. As we chatted, he remarked, "You're well prepared," pitching my ex-husband to the deep end, referring to the individual who lent money to George, effectively sending him into a financial trap. My foster father was a prominent figure in the financial industry, well connected in various fields. George was on a family trip abroad with the proceeds from selling all of my jewelry, which he couldn't have afforded with just his part-time job salary. When I got married, my foster father had instructed me to safeguard two things: the jewelry and the house. "I'm always amazed at your audacity, Dad," I quipped. My foster father had connections with the precious metal buyer that George utilized. He knew that George, who sold my jewelry, was going overseas. "You show up just in time in front of George, and you see through everything," I remarked, astounded by his foresight. Laughing, he mentioned that he also knew about my rapport with the young bartender. I nearly spat out my tea. I chuckled. The manager took a liking to James, so he brought other colleagues along to the bar. That's when my boss asked James, Do you have someone you're interested in here? Be honest. Directed by my manager's leading question, James looked at me and confessed, I like you, Hannah. If you're okay with someone as inexperienced as me, let's get together. Stunned, I reminded him of our age difference and my divorce. But James persisted, expressing his feelings earnestly. In an unexpected turn of events, I found myself with a 23-year-old boyfriend. My manager was overjoyed, declaring himself my wingman. I intended to tell my foster father about James later, but he found out when I mentioned visiting James' bar. He's a very nice young man, my foster father remarked, contrasting him with George. My foster father had always been fiercely protective of me, and though he could be extreme, he was a kind father. I felt grateful to have him in my life. When I shared my plans to start a new family with James, he smiled and congratulated me. Next time, I plan to take a break and go to the hot springs with my dear foster father, with James joining us. I promised to marry James, and I could already envision a harmonious family dynamic between my father and James. With a smile, I reported my plans to my father, who returned the sentiment with warm congratulations. Congratulations, Hannah, he said, sealing the approval for my new journey ahead.
All right, everyone's presentations are done, Nick, the manager, said as he tried to move the discussion forward. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me and began to speak. There's apparently someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. His lackey, Mike, of course, agreed with Nick. I'm leaving. After leaving the meeting room, I started to shut down my computer. I noticed that an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking, there's no point in speaking up, no one will listen, I went home quietly. The next day, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. He was staring at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick? Is something wrong? Mike looked at the screen with him. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Knowing the reason for Mike's distress, I thought to myself, serves them right. My name is Adam. My mother passed away when I was in the 9th grade, and I was raised by my father. Well, you could hardly call it being raised. After my mother passed, my father changed. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and though he still went to work, he squandered our living expenses on horse racing. Because of that, I had to start working part-time as soon as I entered high school. Every month, I went to the convenience store with bills in hand that couldn't be auto-deducted from my father's account. Even though I endured it because I didn't want to be alone, I reached my limit in my second year of high school and dropped out. I found a live-in job at a distant inn. Thank you for everything. The day I left home, my father, still staring at the TV, spoke. Take care. That was our last conversation. Back then, 18 wasn't the age of majority, so I needed my father's permission to work, and I couldn't hide my place of employment. Yet, my father never visited me even once. I kept working just to survive, and before I knew it, I was 42. Years of hard work paid off, and I was transferred to the headquarters. I was thrilled to be recognized by the company, as I thought I'd be working in the field until retirement due to my lack of formal education. Listen up. Our work can change the future of our employees. Don't drag us down. On my first day after the transfer, Nick, dressed in an expensive suit, spoke sternly. There was a reason for this. Our inn was located in a prominent tourist destination, known so well that everyone in the state could sing its commercial jingle. At its peak, we had 5 locations within the state. But that was long ago. Due to financial difficulties and aging facilities, only the place where I had worked for many years and the original establishment remained. I was prepared to lose my job anytime, but now there was a glimmer of hope. With the rise of social media, the tourist area where the inn was located started gaining attention again. Depending on how hard the sales department, where I was transferred, worked, we could either thrive or be forced to give up this prime location to the new hotel chains continuously popping up. For Nick, who had switched careers from another industry to strengthen our sales, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. I understood why he had to be strict. I will do my best. Nick sneered at my enthusiastic declaration. Did you not hear what I said? I'm sorry. I thought I was listening carefully. Out of habit from years of customer service, I apologized reflexively, though I had no idea what had offended him. Someone was watching me with a smirk. In this department, there are those who are expected to excel and those who have been shoved here because they have nowhere else to go. You are the latter. It was Mike, the section chief. He's 7 years younger, at 35. But he was called to headquarters much earlier than I was and had been moving around within the headquarters ever since. I'm not jealous, but I can't accept that he's my boss. Graduating from a prestigious university, he has an unusually high pride and caused many problems as a newbie, making things very difficult for me when I was the front desk leader. When I found out Mike was transferred to the sales department a month before me, I was disheartened. Mike is right. With just a middle school diploma, there's not much you can do. Don't even think about achieving results. As if I didn't exist, Nick remarked, I'm thirsty. Mike eagerly ran to the coffee maker. It seems Mike is Nick's lackey. I regretted being happy about my transfer to headquarters, wishing I had stayed on site forever. Send a direct mail to every company on this list by the end of the day. Nick only assigned me tasks that even a new graduate could handle. What? There are over 1,000 companies. You want me to send to all of them by today? Yes, if you and your fellow misfits split the work, even those with nowhere else to go should finish by today. I glanced at the employees typing away expressionlessly. They were worn out from customer service, only thinking about leaving on time, or were women reassigned after having children, with zero motivation for work. Even Sam, a new graduate from the same university as Mike, who was supposed to be among the expected achievers, had no enthusiasm for the job, having joined the company wanting to do customer service. I don't care what they say, I plan to quit anytime, he said. Only Nick and Mike were highly motivated, making all the decisions between the two of them. I originally only wanted to work at the inn to survive and had no particular attachment to this job. I swallowed my words, thinking I had no right to reprimand them. About a month after the transfer, Nick told us with a frustrated look. To commemorate the 50th anniversary, we've decided to create a plan exclusive for one group per day. Originally, Mike and I were supposed to come up with it, but our president, Mr. Thompson, insists on hearing everyone's opinions. So, you all get a chance. As Nick explained, Mike began handing out prints. Make sure not to embarrass Nick. If your ideas are half-baked, you'll have to redo them. It seemed that they had printed his handwritten notes by Mr. Thompson, which included several questions and a section for free responses. It made sense why Nick had to seek our input, given that all responses had to be submitted to Mr. Thompson. We were given a week to think about it, and a meeting was scheduled to compile our ideas. My plan is to let guests enjoy both the old and modern America. Nick began the presentations. Guests would watch a master confectioner at a nearby traditional sweet shop make sweets in front of them. The welcome drink would be premium tea in a bottle. Nick's plan was certainly attractive. After his presentation, Nick called on us to present in the order we were seated. Just as I stood up for my turn. All right, everyone's presentations are done. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me. There's someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. He was likely talking about me. I joined the company as a part-timer and was made a full-time employee when I turned 20. That was 20 years ago, so Nick and Mike probably had no chance to know until recently. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. After that, Nick kept creating opportunities to solicit everyone's opinions, purposefully excluding me from speaking. The meeting unexpectedly heated up and went past the scheduled end time. A few people asked to leave, and the discussion continued with the remaining few. Still here? Normally, you'd leave in that situation. Though I had no attachment to the job initially, hearing kind words from customers made me want to make them happier. For someone like me, with nowhere to go, the inn was my home and customer service was my life. I felt pathetic about my current self. I'm leaving. I left the conference room and started shutting down my computer. I noticed an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking no one would listen to what I had to say anyway, I quietly went home. The next day, while preparing the DM as instructed, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. In his haste to stand up, he hit his knee on the desk. He stared at his computer screen, his face pale. "Nick! What's wrong?" Mike, thinking he should be the first to rush over, approached Nick while still wearing his coat. He peered at the screen with Nick. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Who is responsible for this company? Nick, more irritated than ever, asked, and Mike answered without checking. Probably Sam. Sam wasn't there because he was attending a morning training session for new hires. Nick gave up on getting angry and returned his gaze to the screen. They were looking at an email that arrived right after the end of the working day yesterday. Apparently, no one, including me, had checked it before leaving. The email was from a large company that used us for their annual employee trips. The president and executives of that company also frequently used our services personally. President of the company, Mr. Mason himself, had declared that neither he nor his company would ever use our services again. Well, some companies cancel their employee trips or stop using our services due to financial struggles. Let's just move on. Mike kept wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Knowing why Mike was so agitated, I quietly watched their interaction. Do you know how much revenue we get from that company? We can find other guests to fill the rooms, but we'll lose the banquet costs, gift shop revenue, rental car fees, and more. Moreover, the gifts were supposed to be prepared by the traditional confectionery shop involved in Nick's proposed plan. If it's known that we incurred such a huge loss at this critical time, Nick's position in the company would be jeopardized. Nick took a deep breath, seemingly trying to calm himself. All right, Mike. Go to New York right now and apologize to Mr. Mason. What? You're coming with me, right? I have urgent work to do. I trust you, which is why I'm entrusting this to you. Please. Mike, believing Nick's sincerity, agreed with a determined look on his face, saying, yes. That's Nick for you. Even if Mike went to apologize, Nick would shift all the blame onto him if the client didn't change their mind. Well, it was Mike's fault to begin with, so it served him right. About 3 hours later, Sam answered a call from somewhere and repeatedly apologized, saying, I'm very sorry. Everyone watched to see what was happening. After ending the call, he informed Nick with a weary tone. When Mike arrived at the client's company, he only made things worse, further infuriating Mr. Mason. He was demanding, get his boss here immediately. It was no wonder Sam was exhausted, dealing with such a call right after returning from training. What is that idiot doing? All right, Adam, you're coming with me. If sacrificing Mike didn't work, then I must be next. Normally, I'd want to refuse at all costs, but I saw an opportunity in this situation. If I can be of assistance, I'd be happy to join you. I obediently followed Nick, and we flew to New York. When we introduced ourselves at the reception, it became clear how serious the situation was, as the receptionist personally escorted us to the president's office. Angry voices leaked through the door, making both Nick and me uneasy. Excuse me. I'm Nick, the supervisor. I understand my subordinate has caused you trouble, and I deeply apologize. Nick, with his experience in the corporate world, knew enough to offer an apology before excuses. However, his customer service skills left much to be desired. I sighed as I saw Mike trembling like a small dog in the corner of the room. What kind of training are you giving your subordinates? Mr. Mason glared at Nick with a red face. The intensity of his gaze made even Nick take a step back. Regrettably, I joined this company only 2 years ago and was unaware of Mike's issues. I should have identified his shortcomings sooner. Indeed. I should have realized sooner. No sensible person would come to apologize and then give a lengthy presentation on the drawbacks of not using their in. Nick froze, his mouth slightly open. Suspecting the worst, I picked up the documents that had fallen to the floor. It seemed Mike hastily prepared these documents on the plane, listing the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1: if you change the venue for the company trip, employees might suspect it's for cost-cutting reasons, leading to a negative impression. Reading it aloud half-jokingly, Nick snatched the papers from my hand and checked the contents with a furious expression. Among the stack of documents was a receipt from a nearby convenience store's copy machine. I felt a pang of dread, hoping he hadn't shown the receipt as well. What do you think he said when I asked what kind of nerve he had to do this? I'm very sorry. Faced with the dire situation, Nick must have thought there was nothing left to do but apologize. In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he uttered words of apology. He said, "I'm a Harvard graduate. I don't believe I said anything wrong." Mike! What have you done? Forgetting his plan to pin the blame on Mike, Nick yelled loudly, even in front of Mr. Mason. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You're still saying that? Look at him." Mike pointed at me with a shaking hand. "I was assigned to headquarters in my 20s and now I'm a section chief. This guy only made it to headquarters at 42. Everything I've done proves I was right. So why are we losing the contract?" Having said his piece, Mike collapsed to the floor. "Of course. You were sent there because you had nowhere else to go." Mike never expected to hear such words from someone he looked down upon. He lunged at me, and Nick hurriedly stepped in to stop him. "Mr. Thompson told me Mike is a quick thinker, and to take good care of him." There's no way he was pushed aside. "Don't make things worse here. He didn't say quick thinker, he said only quick-witted, didn't he?" I don't remember that part. I recalled the many troubles Mike caused when he was a newbie. When Mike was on the front line, his pride was so high that he never apologized to customers. Customer service, especially in our job, doesn't work alone. It brings both good and bad situations. If the front staff or housekeepers made mistakes, or the cleaning company didn't properly clean a room, one had to apologize to the customers regardless of personal fault. Mike, in such situations, would never apologize, insisting he wasn't at fault. This often angered customers, and as the front desk leader, I frequently had to apologize on his behalf. He caused complaints and disrupted operations, which is why he was quickly moved to headquarters. In departments where he didn't interact directly with customers, his quick thinking was beneficial and things went well. But it seemed his flaws were starting to show. Corporate reservations are supposed to be entered into the system by the sales representative. But a quick check yesterday revealed that more than 10 items were missing from the client's reservation. The handover document clearly stated what needed to be prepared. Why didn't you enter it into the system? Why do we have to give them special treatment? Filling rooms near the banquet hall, setting up all the food in advance. Specifying the brand of wine, they're too demanding. No wonder he always angered customers, I thought, feeling a headache coming on. Grouping them in rooms near the banquet hall is for our benefit too. It makes it easier for the staff to set up beds and serve breakfast since everyone's schedule is synchronized. As for the other requests, Mr. Mason suggested them to lighten our load. I didn't know that. Nick finally seemed to realize that Mike was the one who had angered the client. What did you say to them? I just told them we wouldn't give them special treatment anymore. We shouldn't waste effort on things that don't bring in money. I was utterly exasperated at his lack of understanding of customer service. Of course, we shouldn't comply with unreasonable demands. But carrying over successful practices from past stays makes customers feel remembered and enhances their experience. Good memories encourage repeat visits. That's part of our job. I looked down at Mike, who was sitting on the floor. In our job, nothing is a waste. Mr. Thompson likely moved you to the sales department, hoping you'd finally understand this. How do you think he feels now that you've failed to meet his expectations? Mike, tears in his eyes, fled the president's office. I was amazed he still hadn't apologized. You have it tough, Adam. It's okay, we're all employees of the same company. I deeply apologize for this disrespectful incident. Especially after all the care you've shown us. If it weren't for you, Adam, I really would have stopped staying here. When I heard you were moving to the sales department, I was willing to reconsider if you handled it. Seeing us talk so amicably, Nick's face contorted. Do you two know each other? Adam's service is excellent. I always requested him specifically. Normally, we don't accept specific staff requests, but we made an exception for Mr. Mason, adjusting my shifts accordingly. He had personally stayed at our hotel just before my transfer, and during casual conversation, I mentioned, I'm moving to the sales department soon. If I hadn't told him then, things could have been much worse. Please continue to take care of us. I look forward to it. On the return flight, Nick awkwardly offered me a can of beer. It's still working hours. Of course, I had no intention of forgiving him for a single beer. Nick might try to pin everything on Mike and avoid any consequences. While pondering this, a startling fact came to light. Nick, the tea bottles for the plan have arrived. I handed Nick a bottle labeled with our inn's name. They look good. What are you talking about? These are plastic bottles. I had assumed we would use the trendy, high-end bottling tea. But what arrived were ordinary plastic bottles of tea with customized labels. The only unique aspect was the label, which had the inn's name, making it look customized. Upon further investigation, I discovered that a substantial amount of money was set to be paid to the tea company. It was priced like bottling tea. Does this plastic bottle really cost $100 each? The tea inside is specially blended for us. The extra cost is for that. Wouldn't it be better to use another tea company? Or is there a specific reason we must use this one? As Nick continued to make excuses, I showed him a printed email. I informed the tea company's president, Mr. Mitchell, that we discovered irregular payments and he confessed. He said you two were high school classmates and planned to split the extra money. That idiot. Why did he confess? That's not important. You should worry about yourself, this could turn into a police matter. Opening the bottle cap, I suggested. How about calming down with this tea? It supposedly has a relaxing effect. Nick drank the tea frantically. In the following days, decisions were made about their fates. Mike was reassigned to the General Affairs Department, with no chance of transfer or promotion, as per Mr. Thompson's orders. As for Nick, since the payment to the tea company hadn't yet been made, he narrowly avoided legal trouble. Instead, he was encouraged to leave the company, and to avoid further complications, Nick submitted his resignation. Rumor has it that connections between HR departments have made it difficult for him to find new employment. Even though it was good to have those two gone, something unexpected happened in the sales department. Everyone became motivated and united in refining the 50th anniversary plan. In the end, my plan was adopted. We collaborated with the Tourist Information Center to provide personalized guides. The plan, tailored to the number of guests, was truly special for the 50th anniversary. Hey, is Adam's family coming to stay? I immediately booked that special plan for my family. Sam noticed it on the reservation list and quickly picked up on it. Yes, I'm inviting my father. That's great. I might invite my parents too. I lacked the courage to face my father just as Adam. But here, with the confidence Mr. Mason praised, I felt ready. The 50th anniversary plan was a perfect opportunity to reconnect with my father. I hoped to bring back the days when we could laugh together as we once did.